For the past several years, Associate Professor of Heritage and Museum Sciences, Dr. Hugh-Jung Cho, has organized a series of excellent lectures and dynamic speakers exploring the topics and aspects of protecting and preserving cultural property and heritage endangered by wars and illicit trafficking. The museum at Texas Tech is uniquely positioned to collaborate with the Graduate School Heritage and Museum Sciences to provide an extensive examination of the individuals and entities that are focused on these and other critical issues. This is one of the core tenets of a museum, to be an engaged and impactful resource to our community, a conduit of viewpoints, and to facilitate programs that bring these discussions to the public, and more importantly, getting them involved in tackling these critical challenges and inviting their assistance to create solutions. Programs like this are wonderful examples of the multidisciplinary capabilities and possibilities of our great museum. I am grateful to Dr. Cho for collaborating with the museum on this, and to Dr. Brian Daniels for leading the conversation this evening. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker to the podium. Ron Hendrick serves as Provost and Senior Vice President of Texas Tech University. With a career marked by accomplishments in organizational change, academic innovation, student success, fundraising, and research advancement, Provost Hendrick has played a pivotal role in beginning to reshape the university's academic landscape. His commitment to collaboration, innovation, and excellence has made him a leader in higher education administration, contributing to the success of Texas Tech University. Please join me in welcoming Provost Ron Hendrick to the stage.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Here at Texas Tech, we take seriously our responsibility as it relates to preserving history and advancing ethical scholarship and preparing future leaders for this increasingly interconnected world. Creating opportunities for our students, for our faculty, and for the broader community to engage with important issues like the one discussed tonight is central to our mission. These gatherings remind us that the ideas we explore here at the university don't stay on our campus. They shape how we understand and engage in global challenges and how we rise to meet them. The illicit trafficking of cultural property is one of those challenges. While sometimes viewed as an issue primarily for museums, or curators, or archaeologists, or others, its reach is much broader. It's tied to our national security, to international relationships and diplomacy, to organized crime, and importantly, the stability of communities experiencing conflict and disruption. When cultural treasures are taken, or disturbed, or destroyed, we lose more than objects. We lose history, identity, and the stories that explain and bind communities together. So we have a responsibility to understand those complexities, to engage in the work of protecting cultural heritage through our research, through our education, and through our partnerships. The museum at Texas Tech University and our Heritage and Museum Sciences programs reflect that commitment. The work and the conversations they do and they have, like tonight, strengthen our practices and reaffirm that preserving culture is not only about honoring the past, but also about shaping the future. We are fortunate this evening to hear from a national leader in this field, someone whose career has helped shape how museums, policymakers, law enforcement, and others work together to safeguard cultural property. Dr. Brian Daniels' expertise highlights how interconnected this work has become and how essential collaboration is to both preservation and stability. So thank you all again tonight for participating in this important conversation. Your engagement strengthens our communities and our partnerships. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hugh-Jung Cho. I'm Associate Professor at Heritage and Museum Sciences. And thank you, Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Penn, for your wonderful remarks. And thank you for all joining us tonight. Many of you are already familiar with our speaker today, Dr. Brian Daniels, and his extensive works as a leader and a leading specialist in cultural heritage protection. I cited his work in my recent paper too. His work brings together scholarship, policy, and collaboration with law enforcement, Let me briefly highlight a few points about his expertise. He serves as Director of Research and Programs at the Penn Cultural Heritage Center and is deeply engaged in professional leadership, including as the first Vice President of the Archaeological Institute of America and as a board member of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield. Dr. Daniels currently leads national projects that examine museum collections practices and support cultural property investigations, and he has advised institutions ranging from the National Museum of Afghanistan to the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiatives and ICROM, the International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property. We are very fortunate to have him today with us, and I am delighted to welcome him to the stage. Please, Dr. Daniel.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Cho. It really is my pleasure to be with you tonight. This is a wonderful moment, I think, for me, because I know this is going to sound kind of strange, but I've always wanted to come to Lubbock. This is a program here with Heritage and Museum Sciences that I have heard so much about. It's something that, at the University of Pennsylvania, I encourage students to come to for graduate study. And it's because I see the quality of the work that the students exude after they come through these halls. And it's something that's left me really deeply impressed about what a gem is here at Texas Tech. And I've wanted to come in some ways to kick the tires, to actually talk to faculty and understand more about the kind of extraordinary thing that is here. So if you're a student here, or if you're a graduate student here, I have to say, count yourself lucky. Those of us who are in the broader kind of museum ecosystem, that's beyond Lubbock, actually really do admire the work that you're putting in here and what the degree here actually means. It's a credit to the faculty, a credit to the leadership of Texas Tech that this program really is extraordinary. And in many ways, I find that it intersects with the conversation that I want to have tonight in some ways that are unexpected. So tonight, I want to bring us back first to 2003, to this particular institution, to this particular moment of time. This, of course, is the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, and a museum that right now looks intact. It's put together, but of course, the US-led invasion of Iraq disrupted this museum dramatically. And news across the international media showed images like this one of the then director, crying over the looting that occurred at the National Museum, its collections by and large taken out and distributed across different kinds of international networks, criminal networks that caused the widespread dispersal of these collections. These, of course, this is the storage repository of collections from Ur and Babylon and other famed archaeological sites in ancient Mesopotamia. And there has been incredibly heroic work from the moment that this picture was taken to try and bring those collections home, to try and bring them back to Baghdad and try to get this museum on its feet. That is an extraordinary story in and of itself. But what I want to talk about tonight is the effect that this moment had and continues to have in the field of heritage studies. The looting of the Iraq National Museum in many ways was the crucible of how we think about the professionalization of cultural heritage in the United States when we think about the preservation of international cultural property. And so what I want to talk about in many ways is what happened next. What happened after that photograph that makes the modern field of heritage studies and has caused us to be so concerned with developing new ways to prevent that from ever happening again. So let's look at a bit of chronology. In 2004, Congress passes the Emergency Protection for Iraqi Cultural Antiquities Act. This was the first special legislation in U.S. history to prevent the import of cultural property from a specific country, acknowledging that this is material that is by and large stolen from the Iraq National Museum, from the archaeological sites from Iraq, or from the regional museums of Iraq. In 2004, Congress also establishes the Cultural Antiquities Task Force. This is an entity inside the Bureau of Educational Affairs, inside the Department of State, that is specifically designed to encourage collaboration with law enforcement and the State Department to fund the restoration of the Iraq National Museum and other Iraq heritage projects, but also to try and deal with the recovery of those objects stolen from Iraq. And its mandate goes beyond years, in following years, to go beyond Iraq to other countries. In 2006, the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield is created by its founding president, Corey Wagner, specifically to support the ratification of the 1954 Hague Convention, which is the primary international legal instrument designed to protect cultural heritage during armed conflict. This would not be realized until 2009, when the United States gave its unanimous advice and consent to the ratification of the 1954 Hague Convention. Then 4 years later, Congress took a different kind of interest. This was after the widespread burning of manuscripts in Timbuktu. The U.S. Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives instigated an investigation about how different federal agencies were coordinating with each other or were not coordinating with each other in the preservation of cultural heritage globally. This led to, first, Congress enacting the Section 1273 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2015. Now, I want to dwell on this as a moment because this is a rather obscure piece of legislation, but it is actually one that has an interesting connection here to Texas Tech. In that, some of you know, member of faculty here, Andrew DeJesse, Section 1273 is what gave the boost to the creation of the new Army Monuments and Monuments Archives officers under the Civil Affairs program that Colonel DeJesse leads. And so this is a program that has an interesting faculty connection, but it has in many ways its origin and its boost through this specific piece of legislation. In 2016, Congress completes its review, started in 2013, and enacts the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act. And this is the first comprehensive piece of cultural property legislation affecting international issues since 1983. So this is a monumental achievement. And the after effects of this particular law are what I want to talk about. So the main thrust of this particular legislation is it recommends that the Department of State establish a Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee that will work with all the different federal agencies, the departments, the Smithsonian Institution, the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, to develop different kinds of programs that can help with response when a crisis like that in Iraq occurs. And it encourages the CHCC to consult with governmental and non-governmental organizations, including museums, educational institutions, and research institutions, on efforts to protect and preserve international cultural property. So right from the get-go, this particular law envisions a new kind of public-private partnership between American government and American cultural institutions and educational institutions like this one, or like the one where I sit at the University of Pennsylvania. And I want to talk about two of the programs that have come out of the CHCC. Now, these are two programs that I happen to know particularly well because I've been involved in their development. But I want to make the case to you tonight that they are two ways of extending this public-private partnership and help making real the kind of idea that we need to be engaged in the international protection of international cultural property. The first of these is the Cultural Property Experts on Call program, which, in broad summary, is an effort to stitch together the kinds of expertise that's in this room, in other universities and other museums, all in the effort to actually work in the service of responding to this kind of moment of crisis in Iraq, or, as the program has started, working on the theft of cultural property. I'll have more to say on this. And then I will talk about the forensic heritage documentation method, which is a protocol that we've developed for responding to these crisis situations. So the CPOC program has its earliest origins right from the moment that the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act is being contemplated. If you think about the sea of universities that are out there in America's museums, there are so many experts that work on collections management and have specific expertise in understanding different kinds of cultural property. The question for government is how you take that diverse expertise that's out there and how you channel it into a productive conversation where, when law enforcement has a question, when the Department of State has a question, they know who to call. And so the idea behind the CPOC program, which was formalized ultimately in 2020 through a memorandum of understanding, is to develop that single point of contact structure. And here, U.S. museums and your universities really do have a role in addressing the problem of cultural property trafficking. The U.S. has a fairly robust legal system that I'll talk about more in a moment, that make it illegal to import certain categories of commonly looted cultural property into the United States. That is to say that some objects, we've agreed, simply aren't supposed to be here because they're commonly stolen. And the hard part is figuring out what those are and how to keep them safely in their home countries. But when those objects show up at U.S. borders, specialized expertise is needed to understand where that object came from. So if you look at the objects at the bottom here, these are all pretty common kinds of pre-Columbian objects that will show up for import. These are examples, legally excavated and legally exported examples from their countries of origins that are held by the Penn Museum. But if you're a member of law enforcement, you're not likely to know where that object is from. If an object is stolen and smuggled, there's not a little tag on it that says, "Hey, I'm smuggled." Rather, the whole idea is that there is expertise out there that spends a career focused on these kinds of questions about where these objects are from. And how do we connect these dots? We connect these dots because we need to figure out how these objects connect with the very, very dry, boring paperwork that our law enforcement system uses to enforce import restrictions. I don't expect anyone here to be deeply acquainted with the Federal Register, except for maybe Dr. Cho, in looking at what these different kinds of import restrictions look like. But if you're a member of Customs or you're a member of law enforcement, you're going to the Federal Register and you're looking for these lists and you're looking to see whether these objects fit these kinds of broad categories in their descriptions. And this is where specialist expertise is truly needed. So the CPOT program, when working on illicit trafficking, is really designed to strengthen the implementation of these import restrictions by narrowing down different kinds of object origins and what applicable law there is at the start of an investigation. An object shows up, where is it from? The CPOT program has cultivated a very broad network of archaeologists, historians, and other museum professionals in order to be able to answer these questions. And this really is designed to provide that bridge of legal and art historical knowledge. So how does this work? So an object shows up at the border, and the CPOT program receives an email request from law enforcement to a dedicated email line. Internally, we play a little game. What is that object? Where might it be from? And who might we send it to? Which subject matter expert is best equipped to answer this? This is not as easy as it sounds because, as I said, there's no little tag that says smuggle. And we're oftentimes looking, for clues from that object without any other kind of information at all. There's no documentation. There's no other information. Where might this object be from? Once we finally arrive at a conclusion, we'll share that image with other subject matter experts, and we'll return that subject matter expert's response to law enforcement and maybe connect them directly depending on the case. And then finally, we create records about what that interaction is, giving us really the first kind of data that we have about the scope of the illicit antiquities market and cultural property market in the United States. So let me give you a sense of what some of these results are. This program in its current form has run for the past 5 years, from August of 2020 to August of 2025. In that length of time, we've received 460 requests from law enforcement for 8,596 objects. We have 4 staff that are dedicated to the CPOT program. And it includes over 200 subject matter experts at over 100 museums and universities across the United States. Among all of those objects, we've been able to identify countries of origin or likely regions of origin for 7,612. We think that's a pretty good track record. We've struck out on 984, where we have not been able to identify a region. Now, why is that the case? Sometimes we don't have subject matter experts, but more often you're seeing numbers here of objects that are simply perhaps not known to archaeological science. And so we can't necessarily say where these have been looted from. So let me give you a little bit of a global tour about what this project has been able to learn about the illicit antiquities market. And so you're getting a bit of a world premiere of these statistics tonight because this is not something that we've actually shared publicly before. So what you're seeing here is our global map of import restrictions. The countries shaded in blue are countries through which there is a bilateral agreement to restrict the import of cultural property. The countries in green are those countries in which there are emergency actions or other special laws that restrict the import of cultural property. And the countries with the black hatch are those for which there's a special treaty for certain kinds of pre-Columbian property. So you can see this does not cover the entire world in terms of our own protection regime here in the United States. It is still possible, unfortunately, to import legally cultural property from some countries in contravention of local law. This is a bit of a heat map that gives you a sense globally of where our global hotspots are. And there's 2 countries that leap immediately off the map here: Afghanistan and Turkey. And these remain far and away the countries that we see the most trafficked material from anywhere in the world. There is also definitely an emerging nexus in northwestern South America, material that comes out of Colombia and Peru. And I will also say we continue to see a great deal of material emerging out of China and India. So in many ways, these track different kinds of collector interest. And they give us a sense of where demand is, globally. So let me do a bit of a region by region breakdown. So we're going to start with Europe and Eurasia. And you'll see here that we've been able to identify over 1,200 objects from specific countries across Europe. But it's not just countries with import restrictions like Turkey, Italy, and Greece. It really is across the entire continent. And there is a collector interest in gold finds, other coins, and other metal finds, Celtic objects from historic France, the lowlands, and in England. But Turkey remains far and away the country of origin for so many objects. In West Asia and North Africa, again, we see areas of the traditional Holy Land here, and Egypt as our primary countries that we see objects coming from into the United States. What is somewhat surprising is, just given the heavy import regime of Iran, just how much Iranian material we actually show up in the United States. A country where there is a lot more coming into the United States is Yemen. And this is an area that started to spike as the civil war has deepened and worsened there. In Central and South Asia, again, the vast majority of objects that we see coming into the United States come from Afghanistan. Uzbekistan is a recent addition to the bilateral agreements that restrict cultural properties. We haven't seen anything come out of the country yet. And we would hope that countries like Nepal, for instance, we would see bilateral agreements soon. Since we do see material coming from those countries, oftentimes Afghan material, Pakistani material, Nepalese material ultimately finds its way to India before it is exported. In East Asia and the Pacific, there's not a lot of import restrictions. And so China remains the primary, numerically the largest source, but you can see just how much interest there is in so-called tribal art from Oceania. And this remains an area of ongoing concern, for us as cultural heritage specialists, because we don't have a lot of protection capacity in terms of our law or our regulation. And then I'll turn to sub-Saharan Africa, and this remains an area that is very patchy in terms of our international law and regulation. Only 2 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Mali and Nigeria, have bilateral agreements. And that leaves this region particularly vulnerable, again, to that so-called tribal art category. And across the Western Hemisphere, again, I pointed up the problems of northwestern South America already. Mexico still remains a country of origin for a great deal of pre-Columbian material. But the CPOC program also sees a lot of cases from the United States, where there's perhaps material that's being smuggled out of the US rather than in. So what has the CPOC program done? Well, it established a precedent that university professors, museum professionals, all can help in the exercise of protecting international cultural property. It united, a group that could all be marshaled in this broader effort that we all talk about in our classrooms, that we all try and realize in our museum practice, about the actual work of protecting cultural heritage in its countries of origin and preventing this material from entering the legal art trade. But the CPOC program did something more. The CPOC program created an interesting precedent on the side of government that really all of these experts in the US could help with other kinds of law enforcement questions related to cultural property crime. And when you think about it, when you go back to that photograph of that museum director of the Iraq National Museum, that's a crime scene, right? Those objects are stolen from that museum. But how do you record and understand that that's a crime scene, such that the information you gather could be used in other law enforcement activity? That became a major question from the side of the FBI, our crime team, of what potentially the CPOC program could do. Could it actually help in the documentation of these other kinds of cultural crimes? And the prompting for this came from Iraq and to a lesser extent Syria. So we had sites like, or images like this from geospatial satellites start to emerge in 2014. This is the site of Nebi Yunus, also known as the tomb of the prophet Jonah. ISIS dramatically blew up this historic shrine in 2014 and then carted away the rubble. You can see all the dump trucks actually lined up around the historic structure, on those red arrows, before ISIS wipes this entire historic site entirely clean, erasing any kind of trace of what was there. So was this a case of simple erasure of a site, of ISIS's ideological intention simply to make it appear that there were no shrines? The story might be more complex. ISIS began to share propaganda videos throughout 2014 and 2015 of sites like the Mosul Cultural Museum. Now, this is a photograph taken from inside the museum of what this looked like after ISIS was there. But ISIS released video footage of the destruction of collections inside the Mosul Museum in early spring of 2015, destroying these objects with sledgehammers. And what happened next was that this site stayed as such from how ISIS damaged it until the liberation of Mosul. Now, this particular moment, right, it ended up prompting a lot of reflection about what to do. Like, how do you document what happened here, knowing that Iraqi law enforcement was overwhelmed, dealing with the processing of ISIS prisoners and other sympathizers? But also that US law enforcement and other law enforcement agencies couldn't go there because of jurisdictional issues. This is a space that's usually filled by universities and non-governmental organizations for other sites of atrocity. It's just never been tried for cultural heritage. And so what we did was to think about how this might happen for cultural heritage sites like the Mosul Cultural Museum by intentionally creating a process of documentation that involved producing and collecting all forms of available evidence, including from the built environment, damaged objects, media representations, and physical debris and residue that could be germane to the interpretation of certain crimes and other human rights abuses. There were two main efforts of thinking about this out there in the international space. One, the work done by a nonprofit called Forensic Architecture based out of the UK that really focuses on damaged architecture using open sources and different kind of open source intelligence. And the First Aid to Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis, produced by ECROM, which also does the overall damage assessment. But these were not quite up to the level needed for criminological work and for use in a court of law. And so through the CPOC program, we collaborated with the FBI, our crime team, and the FBI evidence response team to actually learn what it means to document a site if you were in law enforcement, and to figure out how to translate that into an academic setting. And so we came up together working with the FBI, a 9-step process that mirrors what an ordinary law enforcement investigation looks like. And our case study became the Mosul Cultural Museum, following the liberation of Mosul. And so you're looking at the exterior of the Mosul Cultural Museum as it was approached by a team in 2019. 4 years rather, after that damage had occurred that you saw with the sledgehammers. But still with just about everything in place in situ, as it was left by ISIS. So I'm going to walk you through what this looked like and the process that we used to do the documentation and the analysis of that site. First, and this is going to sound somewhat basic, but involves the preparation for the investigation, getting everybody around the table, talking about what we might find, talking about what the process is going to be, talking about what the safety considerations are. Now, this was particularly important in the case of the Mosul Museum. You'll see on the right, with the white tie, is the director of the Mosul Museum. And one of the things that he wanted to convey, to us at this meeting was that although all of the attention was going to what ISIS blew up and destroyed, we might want to pay some more attention to the possibility that ISIS has stolen material from this museum and not just destroyed it. The second step involves securing the scene. And quite simply, this involves taking photographs of what it looked like when you arrived, making sure that there's a record of what you see before you step into the space, and that it's safe to enter. Step 3, conducting a survey, going through the actual site, trying to figure out what might have happened, trying to figure out what kinds of evidence remain in the case of cultural institutions, what kind of objects might remain, what kinds of evidence of theft there might be, what kinds of potential booby traps there might be in a place like the Mosul Cultural Museum. And there was a lot of debris to go through. And you're getting a sense here of what this kind of rubble looked like. Now the question is, what kind of story gets built out of this? And what kinds of record keeping need to be made when you're trying to make sense of all of this rubble? Now, for those of you who are archaeologists in the room, this is pretty standard fare from archaeology, right? It's our job to put together all of these different parts to tell a story. It's just that we're trying to tell a story here that's going to be relevant for a court. And to record all of that information in a systematic kind of way about what our observations are as we move forward to doing that kind of analytic work. Fourth involves photography. And this is one thing I learned in this process, was just how deeply embedded the FBI evidence response team is in complete photography on the highest possible settings you could set on your camera. And creating really strict photo logs of all of the photographs that are collected. Making sure that every room is photographed upon entry, with hundreds, if not thousands of photographs. That every corner of a room is photographed at 30-degree angles in order to actually capture what that entire what that entire space will look like. And here you're seeing that from one of the corners. Taking photographs at far, medium, and near distances in order to make sure that any kind of object is actually captured in context. And here you're seeing a part of the mortar. Next, it involves basic sketch work of everything in place. Not perfect sketch work, but preliminary sketch work, just to have an idea about what this looks like ahead of a later step. Sixth, it involves marking, collecting, recording, and preserving evidence. Now, this is something that is definitely true, for law enforcement that does that kind of evidence collection. But here, you see that 12 again, that mortar fragment. But what you also see at number 13 is blasting paper. Essentially, what covers gunpowder and bomb-making material. And all of this was just there, present at the Mosul Cultural Museum. Again, 4 years after the fact. And these kinds of up-close photographs help create that kind of documentary record about what that damage is. What you see here is actually just a table of all of the evidence, collected from one of the rooms, the first room of the Assyrian Hall. And this, of course, is every director's worst nightmare. No one wants to walk into a museum that actually has this kind of scattered debris or theft or destructive remnants. But what we did and what we elected to do was to treat every object we found just as an object, whether it was an artifact or a fragment of an artifact, or whether it was a portion of that mortar, simply because of time, in order to actually quickly go through and record everything that was present in each one of these halls. Then every single one of those objects needs a measurement. An X coordinate, a Y coordinated, a delta, in order to actually make sure that we can map all of those objects in place. Why do all this work? So there's evidence for potential recovery. Seventh, and this is perhaps one of the single most critical things that I learned, was the importance of a departure survey. Taking a photograph as you walk out the door of what the museum or the site looked like when you left it. It's a way of showing you didn't plant evidence, and it's a way of illustrating to a court that you did your legitimate due diligence in actually doing the work. Finally, we get to the post-processing of all of that data, all of the photographs, all of the measurements. And this is what, upon reconstruction, the full floor plan of the Mosul Cultural Museum looked like. I'm going to pause here not to just talk about the evidence process, but I'm going to talk about what it all meant when we put it together. I will say one of the things that I learned is I never want to draw another brick again. But what we did learn here was a very different kind of story from the one that ISIS wanted to tell about the destruction of this museum. Every single photograph, every single video that we saw in any of the ISIS propaganda material was all in this hall, not the rest of the museum. And what was extraordinary about that hall was that there were no objects or object fragments found in it whatsoever. Everything was debris. Now, that implies quite the cleanup job if you're breaking and smashing objects with a sledgehammer. It was weird that there was no microfragment anywhere. Now, that's not the case in any of the other rooms. All of the other galleries had fragments of objects, but not fragments that came from their destruction. They were fragments that came from ripping them out of how they were displayed. They were the kinds of breaks that you expect if you're mishandling an object. They're the kind of breaks you expect if you take something off of how it's hung on a wall. And what was especially interesting in the top view was all of those brick falls. All of those brick falls were objects that were mounted in the wall. And the brick falls came from how the objects were ripped out. What we realized was we were not looking at the ideological destruction of heritage here. We were looking at an elaborate cover-up of a really expensive museum theft. But the only way we would have ever gotten to that conclusion is if we had gone through the painstaking work of actually photographing all of those angles and all of those corners, doing all of those measurements, recording everything brick by brick, and doing that kind of survey. Because that kind of story really only became visible when we saw the patterns of how all of the bricks fell, about what the distribution was of the fragments of the objects, what the kinds of museum collections pieces we had were seeing. Finally, the final work of this was a technical report. Something that I hope will come to public light in the near future. But it described essentially everything that I just said to you in summary about why we have come to think of the Mosul Museum's destruction, not so much as a destruction event, but as a theft event, but as the exemplar of how universities and how museums can be supportive to law enforcement in doing this kind of documentation. This was something that was only made possible through the CPOC program. Because the FBI needed to have that kind of legal structure in order to be able to have a public-private partnership with America's universities and museums. And that kind of structure both enabled them to work with us, but also created the kind of structure and the kind of precedent for being able to share these methods of documentation outward. What you're looking at here is a very cold late winter of 2022 in Ukraine. The kinds of documentation strategies that we used at the Mosul Cultural Museum, we were able to share with Ukrainian colleagues who took the standards we developed and then applied them more broadly throughout the whole of Ukraine, documenting the different kinds of damage suffered to cultural sites across the country, which shows, perhaps not unsurprisingly, that there is a direct pattern to the targeting of cultural infrastructure across the country. The Ukrainian Heritage Monitoring Lab was stood up specifically to do this kind of documentary work and to record it systematically in that 9-step process that I outlined for you a little bit ago. Through their work, they have now documented over 1,500 sites that have been so damaged across Ukraine, where we can't say with any degree of certainty that this was collateral damage, but that this was in many ways direct targeting. Now, how would we know this? We would not know this unless this kind of documentary work had been done. And this, I think, is a testament to what the CPOC program, is and what it has become. It's become the necessary way for government to be able to communicate with the arts and cultural sector of the United States around shared issues of concern and preservation. It's become a way that we can share expertise more broadly internationally. It's become a way that we can really work outside the university walls, work outside the museum walls to be able to do the kind of documentation that allows for the future recovery of objects when they're stolen, but also holds out the promise for different forms of accountability when that is actually possible in violent conflicts like Ukraine. We now look to take the work that the CPOC work has done with this kind of documentation method in other countries, in other contexts like Sudan, to apply it retrospectively in places like Georgia, and perhaps to look for other European countries in which we need to start doing this kind of training now, in case that there's other kinds of deliberate attacks across the cultural sector, especially in Eastern Europe. Now, none of this work was necessarily envisioned when the CPOC program started. The CPOC program was in many ways designed to create that connection around illicit trafficking and connecting subject matter expertise to being able to describe what happens when we don't understand what that object is. But it's grown to become something much more. And it's something that I'm particularly proud to be a part of. Really proud to lead a team of wonderful colleagues and being able to work with museums like this one, universities like this one, in order to unite to protect international cultural heritage more broadly, but really find ways to connect the needs of government with the kind of expertise that we have in museums and universities. Thinking about this for a moment and thinking about the words from your provost, by way of introduction, it's hard to connect what we do in a museum, what we do in a classroom, with the needs, with policy needs, with actionable needs of law enforcement. The CPOC program is one way that we do that. And it's a very concrete way that we in the cultural sector can really work to assist in these kinds of law enforcement and accountability actions, but also to help keep cultural heritage where it belongs, or when we see cultural heritage targeted, we can really work to hold perpetrators accountable for what they've done. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you might have. I see a question back there.
Yeah, have any of the artifacts from Mosul shown up in black market contexts or anything like that?
Why, yes. So perhaps most infamously, they showed up in the possession of an ISIS financial leader in Syria, Abu Sayyaf, who was targeted by US Special Forces in 2016. And that material was recovered and returned to Iraq.
And so there's evidence that they're trying to sell this stuff off and to support efforts.
Absolutely. I mean, the Abu Sayyaf raid is perhaps some of the most direct evidence that we have, because quite literally the objects were recovered from effectively the chief financial officer of ISIS in Syria. And so that's not small change. And I mean, that is the single most direct evidence that we have of ISIS looting activity.
You have a question?
Yes. With the attacks in Ukraine on the cultural sites, is that also a case of looting, or is that more direct, like Russian assaults on their culture?
So it's a combination, and there is, I mean, the bulk of the work started, and certainly the documentation efforts in Ukraine are very specifically about direct attacks on Ukrainian cultural sites. That very quickly has also evolved to include evidence of theft. And evidence of theft actually came very, very quickly and, in this particular setting. So it's not unlike what we saw actually in the Second World War, when we saw attacks by Nazis on Slavic culture and then the widespread theft of Slavic art from cultural institutions. And we're seeing that right now in Ukraine. There have been well-documented cases of looting of sites like the Kherson Regional Art Museum from the Mariupol Museum of Local Lore. And I was actually just reviewing one this morning of a theft from the Prokofiev Museum, which is dedicated to the acclaimed pianist and composer Prokofiev.
You mentioned specifically that, is there any correlation between the type of artifacts that are looted from there? Is it from a specific era in history? Is it from Mesopotamian culture specifically? Is there any artifacts from what would be considered biblical in that sense? And also, you also mentioned that there are other sites such as Sudan and Ukraine, these sort of conflicted areas. Is there any sort of correlation as well with Israel-Palestine, with what's going on with there? Is there any sort of thing going on with there?
So let me start with the question about what kind of correlation we see around what objects are stolen. And this is a slightly difficult question to answer because it seems that it's not so much about the theft, the site of theft itself, but it's about the market. So in the case of the Mosul Cultural Museums, there are three galleries. There's a gallery of Neo-Assyrian material, things like lamassu, and other acclaimed relief sculpture. There was a gallery of Islamic material, medieval Islamic material, and then there was a gallery of material from the site of Hatrim material. There's virtually no market for Hatrim material anywhere in the world. It's not that it's uninteresting, there's just not a market for it. And it's probably not coincidental that all of the ISIS images and video stills were taken from Hatrim gallery. But the material from the Neo-Assyrian gallery and the material from the Islamic gallery was equally stolen. So what's the end market for that material? In all likelihood, the Neo-Assyrian material is going to be more interesting for sale in places like the United States, in places like Europe, Western Europe especially. For the medieval Islamic material, probably the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And so in many ways, I think that ISIS was being equally rapacious in terms of what it was going to take. What the outcome was up to essentially their own market distribution work and where that might go. In terms of a similar situation in Ukraine, it also seems that Russian efforts to loot cultural institutions have been equally opportunistic. It seemed like early on that there was some emphasis on the really famous golden Scythian material. I think that's given way to more whole-scale removal of cultural objects to Russian-controlled territory in the Ukraine conflict. We haven't seen really any of the Sudanese material turn up yet. The looting of the National Museum of Sudan is a relatively recent event. And so this hasn't kind of worked its way through, but again, that also seems to have been wholesale. In terms of the current conflict in Israel and Gaza, we haven't really seen any of that material come up or show up in any international markets that's related to the events following October 7th, 2023. We have seen material looted from both Israel and Gaza show up in international markets prior to that time. And so that that points to different kinds of collaboration and coordination through smuggling markets, both in Israel and in Gaza.
So it seems like the work that you've been able to do here is like very, very thorough, and it's amazing to see the kind of academic arm of kind of cultural protection be able to be leveraged in this way. I just wanted to ask if these methods could also be applied to kind of a smaller scale, kind of like what you were saying with work in Ukraine for preserving these cultural materials. Given the prevalence of like cell phones and people with access to social media, do you think that these methods could be applied through a more public lens so that you could get, well, not as quite a thorough construction of efforts to preserve these materials, at least a more widespread understanding of how to preserve these materials?
That's a really good question. And so I want to, kind of like take this up in, a slightly different way. They're essentially, cell phones are ubiquitous. Most of you probably have one in your pocket right now, right? And so why not, flip on the camera, take a photo, and call it a day? And the answer to that is that's really great if your end goal is raising public awareness about theft or damage. Like in being able to, share it up on social media, give it over to the New York Times if you got a really good photo, and be able to raise broad subject awareness. Yeah, none of that actually works in a court of law. And so this really is a question of what your end goal is. And so one of the things that, I have said, especially on the work generated through CPOC and the subject matter expert network, is that it's really, really tempting to use all these open source methods. And I think that awareness about this is a critical issue, and I absolutely encourage people to follow up on that. But if you're going to do the kind of documentary work, if your end goal is object recovery, or your end goal is any kind of accountability, then you actually do need to use a much slower and more comprehensive and admittedly ludicrously laborious method. And it's really a difference in end goal. And there's no disrespect here, I think, to either side. It's just a different goal. And I know we have a bunch of questions in the middle.
Welcome and thank you for the presentation. I find forensic heritage documentation as a great effort, and my question is related to that. In descriptions of illicit trafficking, particularly in the cases you have presented, we often engage with culture in static forms and ontology. How can forensic heritage documentation address intangible dimensions of heritage when trafficking disrupts cultural practices, meaning, and also community relationships surrounding an object or a site?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I think of two things here. The first comes in the hard work of repair. And thinking about what repair means, in its broadest kind of sense. What happens when a physical object is actually ripped from its community of origin? Let's talk about a really kind of common object that we see a lot of, and that is idols taken from temples in Nepal. Right? This is an object that's commonly looted. It's an object that shows up on U.S. markets constantly. What does it mean when that object is actually taken from that community, right? There's a sense of loss. That community can't practice, right? That kind of intangible aspect is what's lost. And what I think of here in terms of this work is that the work of doing the documenting is not so much the work of documenting the practice, the work is about documenting that theft in order to be able to do that work of repair. I want, as a professional goal, to be able to say that I am dedicated to returning that object to where it belongs for that community of faith to be able to continue its practice. But I know that from a law enforcement perspective, a legal perspective, I'm working as a translator. I have a broad anthropological goal of returning that community of practice to wholeness. I've got to be a translator doing the work of making that intangible practice legible to law enforcement to facilitate that return. That's hard because I'm keeping a very kind of rigid system in my head with an ultimate goal of actually trying to return to community practice. Which gets to the second part of your question and how I think about it. One of the things I've come to embrace, admittedly reluctantly, given everything that I just said, was that a lot of the intangible heritage practices are in some ways downstream of the site of where those practices occur. Our international system of law enforcement requires us to put more emphasis on that site of place of the practice in order to provide a maximal sense of protection. Now, I will say I'm not totally satisfied myself with that answer, but I don't really have another way around it. So when we talk about forensic heritage documentation, we're talking about a building that serves as a museum, a building that serves as a house of worship, a building that serves as an educational institution, right? All of those are actually legal categories, right? And doing that kind of documentation work around that legal category is really, in many ways, what matters for purposes of law enforcement action or for purposes of recovery action. It doesn't necessarily satisfy that site in terms of what actually happens there. And so this is what I meant by repair, right? I think of this work as that act of repair, but that I have a lot of foundational work to do here in that work of translation in order to be able to satisfy that work of community repair.
Hi. So kind of what you're talking about with the Mosul Museum and stuff, you guys are certainly not just acting, U.S., right? But you're working with local authorities, I imagine, local experts, and also staff of the museums and sites and whatever affected. How do you go about those building that kind of important network, and what advice would you have for making the most efficient use of that relationship?
So that none of this work is possible without these kinds of personal connections. This is not where the U.S. puts on a flag and suddenly parachutes in. That's not how this works. And I think that, one of the things that's so true about the museum community is that it is very tightly networked. And I think for those of you who are just interested, this is something I really hope that you experience over the course of your career, is this incredibly strong sense of international solidarity that occurs among museum professionals. And so I often feel like and I often experience that I'm just a couple of phone calls or a couple of emails away from a colleague in one of these spaces. One or two in Ukraine, or 3 in the case of Sudan, that suddenly end up on my desk. And it's about, in many ways, the network of museum professionals passing it through the network of international museum professionals to try and actually get to the right place. And I mean, the International Council of Museums, ICOM, does a lot of that kind of facilitation. I mean, it's sort of where we all sort of sit professionally, at least in an international sense. I think that in terms of making efficient use, a lot of it is that strong collaboration. I mean, the Mosul Cultural Museum I mean, it was the director of the museum, the chief conservator, and his staff that you saw in those photographs. I mean, they were working alongside, our colleagues who were on site at the Mosul Cultural Museum. And without them, none of that would have been possible. And, and in many ways, it's their ask to make. Like, they knew that something wrong had happened here, but they also were keenly aware that without any kind of documentation, there's not a possibility of accountability or recovery. So how do you actually do that work? And it's, who do you call in that kind of sense? And the answer is really the handful of people who do this, and that's frankly what happened in Ukraine, was reaching out through those networks when Ukrainian colleagues were seeking that kind of information. I think we had a question down here.
Well, I have a microphone here, and why don't we have just one more question?
When we saw those pictures of Palmyra being raised, is there maybe something hopeful to think that it might have just been looting?
Palmyra was a different story. Palmyra is particularly complicated. And some of it had to do with ISIS's own internal divisions between Iraq and Syria. I think there's a working theory that there was probably more theft in Iraq and more destruction in Syria by ISIS. However, it's also not entirely clear what the inventory was of the Palmyra Museum when ISIS arrived. There was definitely material there. What was there is a bit of a question. There was also additional looting by ISIS from the side of Palmyra after those images of destruction. And some of that material was recovered actually by Syrian heritage professionals as ISIS tried to traffic the network, not by the government, not by the Assad government, but by independent heritage professionals who surreptitiously slipped it into other museum collections, and their work has been truly heroic. But unfortunately, like the destruction of the Temple of Al-Shamin, which was on the cover of New York Times, that one, unfortunately, was not a cover for a theft. That one was definitely the destruction of that temple, specifically, in all likelihood, because it was going to be on the cover of the New York Times.
Well, I think we are actually out of time. I know there are some related questions too. Why don't we continue our conversation outside? The public reception is prepared. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.